For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sarah Truby. I'm the Habitat Conservation Manager at Sky Island Alliance. And today I am joining you from Tucson, Arizona, where the Office of Sky Island Alliance sits on the traditional lands of the Tohono Pasquayaki, and other indigenous peoples. As we're getting started, my colleague Rick will post into the chat a link for you to learn more about our lands here. As we get started, and as people are still joining from the waiting room, feel free to drop into the chat if you have ever seen a rattlesnake, and if so, if you know what species. I'd just love to hear more about your rattlesnake experience. So feel free to drop that in the chat as we get started. Today, we're going to learn about some pretty exciting behavior in rattlesnakes. When I was doing my dissertation research here in Southern Arizona in caves, which was not related to snakes, but I kept running into snakes in cave entrances, particularly on the way out. Snakes seem to be pretty curious, and they would come in and kind of, sniff the stuff that we left. I don't know if that's true, Melissa. You're going to have to correct me on that. And they'd always be there on the way out. And I actually used to get like pretty afraid. And I think that fear is something that is pretty a usual response to snakes. And so I'm really excited for Melissa's talk today, where we can turn that into some curiosity around these really incredible creatures. So I had the honor of seeing Melissa speak once before while we were on a field trip in the Galura Mountains, northeast of Tucson. And I was so blown away by her breadth of knowledge and appreciation for rattlesnakes that I knew that we had to invite her here to speak with you. Oh, fantastic. I'm seeing people right in the chat. We've got some diamondbacks, some young Arizona black rattlesnakes, a baby rattlesnake crossing the road a few months ago. This is exciting. Look at all these wonderful snake encounters. So
Wow.
I'd like to introduce Melissa now. So Melissa Amarello is the co-founder and executive director of Advocates for Snake Preservation. Once again, Rick will paste a link into the chat for you to learn more about Melissa's organization. And today, Melissa will speak with us on how rattlesnakes are awesome moms. We'll learn about babysitting, drinking behavior, how these remarkable reptiles care for and protect their young. Melissa will draw on her more than 2 decades of studying and living with reptiles to show what snakes are really like through stories and videos. As a reminder, please remain muted during the talk, but feel free to type into the chat any questions or comments that you have, and we'll address those at the end. So I'd like to pass it over to Melissa to go ahead and get started. Thank you.
All right. You all, it's so awesome to see all the fun rattlesnake sightings that you all are like excited about, not scared about. And I saw that there was some compliments about the work ASP does, and I really appreciate that. So I've actually like kept the videos today to a minimum. I'm sorry. But I just often like there's issues with Zoom, and I didn't want that to like slow down the talk. So there'll be a link at the end where a lot of the videos that I would often include in this presentation, as well as just like a lot of cool videos of mommies and babies and other family member rattlesnakes like hanging out together so that you can check those out on your own time. Yeah, so I'll let this roll for another second. Thank you all for coming today. Love to see this much interest in rattlesnake families because they're the best. But yeah, I'm going to talk about how rattlesnakes are awesome moms. And I'm just going to like real quick tell you a little bit about Advocates for Snake Preservation. So we're a localish organization. We started in Tucson in 2014. We've since moved our headquarters to New Mexico, but we divide our time between Southern Arizona and Southwest New Mexico. So we do work in both places. And basically, like my partner Jeff and I that started the organization, we used to just do field biology, studying snakes, mostly rattlesnakes, especially like some of their social and parental care behavior. And what we realized was that more than like more science and more data about snakes, what snakes really needed was for people to understand them a little bit better, both what they're really like to fight against the myths and misunderstanding that's out there and that seems to cause a lot of people to dislike or fear snakes. And also to help people who don't necessarily fear and dislike them. They like them, but they're still maybe a little apprehensive about having especially venomous snakes living in their backyard, and they'd like some information on how to coexist with them. So that's why we started this organization. We do like kind of everything we do can be couched in these two groups, both telling stories about wild snake behavior, again, to counter those prevailing myths. And that's what I'm going to be doing today. And then we also provide resources to resolve human snake conflicts in a way that works out good for snakes and people. And so I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end if there's time, or you can definitely like find resources about that if you have questions by checking out our website. So where we are headed today, I'm going to talk about who we studied and how we did it. I'm going to give a brief overview of some seasonal patterns and rattlesnake behavior, especially as it relates to their reproduction in the Southwest. I'm going to talk about what nurturing looks like in rattlesnakes and defense. And finally, super fun, babysitting. So we've got, depending on who's splitting or combining different species, there's like around a dozen rattlesnake species in Arizona, a ton. And they probably all do some form of parental care, but we've only looked at in these four species. So I'm just going to start in the upper left and go clockwise a little bit just to give you some basic information about them. Western diamondback rattlesnakes, as we saw in the chat, these are kind of the classic, most commonly encountered rattlesnake. They're large. They're the ones that when there's a rattlesnake in the movie or a TV show, it's usually Western diamondbacks. They're also the ones that are most likely to show up in people's yard. They're large, they're generalists, they live in a lot of different habitats. They eat a lot of things, mainly mammals, but they will eat lizards, especially when they're small. And some of the adults learn about bird baths and become kind of bird eating specialists too. So really varied lifestyle. Arizona blacks, these are one of my favorites. It's just we've done a lot of work on them. They are like a medium-sized rattlesnake. They don't get quite as big as Western diamondbacks, but pretty big. And they live at like mid to high elevation and are especially fond of riparian areas, and that's where I see them most often. They're also mainly mammal eaters, although the small ones do take more lizards, and they will occasionally take birds. Most snakes, and this is certainly true of like most rattlesnakes in our area, are pretty general with like if it fits in their mouth, they'll eat it. There's not a lot of like super specialization with our snakes. So a lot of them are pretty general eaters. Black-tailed rattlesnakes, these are probably the second most commonly encountered rattlesnakes, especially if you spend time in the mountains. Although they do live in the low desert too, they seem to be encountered more in the mountains and foothills. They are also a pretty large species. They do get almost as big as Western diamondback rattlesnakes. In the mountains, they tend to be yellow in color with these dark brown blotches, like the one pictured here. The ones that live more in the low desert tend to be kind of greenish or tan. And unfortunately, that gets them confused. Any snake that has any sort of greenish tinge at all gets labeled a green Mojave. And that could be a whole talk in itself about why this, they're not as scary and awful as people think, but a lot of people do think that. So that unfortunately gets a lot of blacktails killed because they are sometimes kind of greenish in appearing. Blacktails tend to eat mammals, relatively large mammals for their size. So squirrels, bunnies. Although again, the little ones, because they're too small for that, will take lizards and they probably take birds sometimes too. Rock rattlesnakes. Yeah, rock rattlesnakes and Arizona blacks are always competing to be my favorite because they're both, or favorite rattlesnake, just because they're both so cool. These are probably the least, well, not probably, these are definitely the least often encountered of all of these species, and one of the rarest to see in Arizona, period. They're small. These are one of the so-called Mexican montanes because they live in the mountains and they mostly live in Mexico. They just barely get into the US in southeastern Arizona, southern New Mexico, and West Texas. And when I say small, these snakes are like max out at like 2 foot ish. And as big around as my thumb, so just kind of like average human thumb. They're very small. Their rattles are tiny. They don't sound like the rattling that you may have heard on TV or whatever. They sound more like an insect buzzing. They have tiny heads. They're the ones that I often use as an example when teachers are trying to get me to tell the kids how to tell a rattlesnake from a not rattlesnake. But it's really hard because they don't always have those big triangular heads and large rattles that make a lot of large rattling noises. Rock rattlesnakes are very small, and as their name implies, they really like rocky areas. They're not in rocks all the time, but they are there a lot. And they are also like mid to high elevation snakes, so not a desert species at all, at least not around here. So those are the four players. And we haven't done a whole lot with Western diamondback rattlesnakes. I did want to include them because, as a very common species, they've been studied a lot, and including some observations of parental care in that species. But mostly what other studies had seen was a single female with their babies, not not and with ours, like actually the only two observations we have of nesting in Western diamondback rattlesnakes were high elevation, like around 6,500 feet, so pretty high for Western diamondbacks. And instead of solo nesting, they were nesting in groups, which are called rookeries. And so this table is just to give a little overview of how many observations we're talking about. And so with Western Diamondbacks, we have actually seen well that snake that was in the last slide, like her nest again, but these numbers only go through 2024. We haven't updated this for what we saw last summer. And both times she nested in a rookery situation. So that just means, like birds, there are multiple females gestating, giving birth, and often caring for each other's young together. Whereas the nest column, that just means like one mama and her babies only. So yeah, it's now been two rookery situations, two litters for Western Diamondbacks. So not much, but I like to include it just because this was kind of relatively new information that they will rookery together as well. And you can see with the other species, it's pretty even that they will do nest and rookeries, and often in the same places. It doesn't seem to be habitat dependent, and it's sometimes not even um, like like the individuals have specific preferences. I can think of one Arizona black female who the first time we saw her with babies, or the first two times we saw her with babies, she nested all by herself. And then the last time we saw her with babies, she was in a rookery situation with several other females. So this is just a picture of another example of that. This is at one of our newer sites where we studied this in New Mexico. These are all rock rattlesnakes, and the photo on the left is a rookery, and then the photo on the right was a female nesting all by herself. And these two sites were like 50 yards from each other, so pretty close, definitely within a snake's like daily possible distance to travel. But they're doing these different things, and yeah, we don't know why. So, in thinking about like how we study this, so one reason that often rattlesnakes are portrayed in pictures and movies is like coiled up and rattling is because they are scared of us. And so most of the time when we see them in the wild, what we're seeing is their defensive behavior. So that is not helpful when you're trying to study any other sort of behavior. We want to be able to see them doing what comes naturally. And one way we can do that is by trying not to frighten them, staying back. And one thing that makes that really easy is knowing where things are going to happen. So rattlesnakes tend to use the same nest sites year after year after year. The same individuals and also different individuals will use the same sites. So once we learn where these sites are, we can keep coming back to them, and and then we can see like who's going on, and like and we can approach those sites knowing that the snakes are going to be there very carefully so that we don't frighten them. So this is one particular nest site that we've seen used over and over and over again. Some of these are the same snakes. Some of these are, there's some different snakes, different mamas in here too. Oops. And this knowing about these sites and returning to these sites has has enabled us to see multiple nestings by the same individuals and other individuals. And yeah, like about half of our sites are used at least twice and some up to six. And that six is certainly not a maximum. That has more to do with the number of times that we've visited the same sites because we have moved around and studied them at different places. So also helping us like not elicit a defensive response from the snake is to use remote photography. So when we first started, we had these plant cameras, not great quality, but it did enable us to like set them up and just be able to film what the snakes were doing when people weren't around to elicit a defensive response. As time has gone on, when we started doing that in 2010, and yeah, as time has gone on, we've like improved. So now we tend to use more GoPros because the quality is a lot higher, so we can get better footage, and it's a lot easier to get them closer to the snakes because the cameras are smaller. So kind of the next step in, especially as we get into later in the talk, thinking about things like babysitting, is being able to tell who's pregnant and who's not without handling the snakes or like taking an ultrasound, which is something I have done on a snake, well, or been there when a vet did an ultrasound on a snake. So it's actually because of their linear body plan, it's pretty easy to tell the difference between a pregnant and a not pregnant snake, or one who's going to give birth this year versus one who may have given birth last year. So these two photos are of the same snake. This is Droopy. The photo on the left was 2011, and the photo on the right is 2012. And these were both taken in April when she was just coming out of her den for the year. And on the left, she's very thin. She gave birth last year. We know because we observed that family dynamic. And then the photo on the right, hopefully you can see she's in much better shape. She's really big. If you can look close at her body, especially as it gets closer to the tail, you can almost start to see skin in between those scale rows, which is a good indicator, especially when it's low in the body, not in the middle of the body, that there are babies gestating in there. Now, April is still pretty early, but she's in good health. And so seeing a snake at this time of year, like these photos are both taken around this time of year, would make me think that's a female who's probably going to give birth this year. So it's also helpful for us to be able to identify individuals. So that way we can find out about things like, are they reusing the same sites for subsequent births? Are they, how often are they giving birth? Are they giving birth every year, every 2 years, every 3 years? And we don't want to have to like pick them up, so we don't use the methods that most scientists use, so like injecting microchips or clipping scales, or doing radio telemetry. We identify them by their patterns, which is just how biologists do animals that like you can't catch every time. So think jaguars with their patterns. You can use those to identify individuals. And it's the same for rattlesnakes. This method also works really well for Gila monsters too. And so on this slide, this is just showing the same snake as she went from a baby or babyish in 2010. And she was actually born in 2009. So she's a few months old here. And inside that yellow circle is one of her unique blotches that we have used to identify Zona as she's gotten old, 7 years old, the last time we saw her. And although the size of the snake obviously has changed a lot. She started off as a pencil and was probably 2.5 feet long and much bigger around by 2016. The relative size and shape of those weird blotches stays the same through time. just with Arizona blacks, it gets a little bit harder to pick out as they get darker when they get older. But otherwise, this method has worked really well for us to identify individuals without having to touch them. All right, so I want to give a quick overview of some seasonal patterns in rattlesnake behavior because, at least in the Southwest, because I think it differs a lot when we're thinking about baby season and just how some animals that I think many of us are more familiar with work. So these are kind of the main seasons, especially like related to a reproductive female. And I'm going to go ahead and put up the here when these things taking place. And then I'm going to go through, so I wanted to give you the big picture, and then I'm going to go through these each individually. So we'll start with the monsoon season. So for anyone who's not local to the Southwest, the monsoon season is our one of our two rainy periods of the year. It's July, August, September if we're lucky. Often it's much shorter or not at all. But regardless, during that time of year, so let's think about a female who's giving birth this year. And so last July, August, and September, she was feeding. This is when they do a lot of their feeding. And that would have also been their courtship season. So courtship and mating happens during the monsoon season. That's also when a lot of their feeding takes place. And so we can kind of think about last summer is when she was getting courted. In this case, these are two Western Diamondbacks. And he's courting, not quite mating with her yet, but he's hoping. And then in the fall, and this depends on the species and the elevation, so it can happen as early as October. Some of them won't go into their dens until November, December, but they all go into the dens and spend at least part of the winter, hibernating. And so, yeah, so that's a big chunk of the year. For some of these snakes, they will do that in groups. That is another time when they're social. So this is two rock rattlesnakes, and this is actually when they started coming out again in the spring. Sometimes they nest in group or den in groups. Sometimes they nest or geez, den by themselves. And then the emergence period, so this is when they're starting to come out, and this is where we are now, but they haven't necessarily like moved away from their dens. So depending on the species and where they are, and especially the ones that are in groups will often like hang out around the openings to their dens before they take off for feeding times and other active season activities for weeks. And so this can start in early to mid-February for some of the desert Western Diamondbacks and some of the high elevation species like Arizona blacks in some places will still be around their den sites in mid-May. And then what we often see, which is true for many of the snakes in this group, is that the females that are going to nest nearby, because a lot of times their nests, especially rookery nests, are located near these communal dens, they never really leave. They just sort of shift from the good, like closer to their overwintering sites to they might have to move, I don't know, 10, 20 meters to like where their nest site is. And so this group here, they're kind of on the verge of this is a social basking site in the late spring. And so they will soon be moving to a gestation site. And so this is late spring. And then for us, the dry summer, so through June for many species, where the females are hanging out together, they're getting a lot of sun. I like to call it cooking their babies. It's maybe not the best phrase, but anyways, they're gestating as their babies are developing before they get ready to give birth. And that brings us back to the monsoon season again. And this is when, for this female's lifetime, if she's been gone through the gestation, this is when they give birth and when they take care of their kids. Some of the species go actually a little pre-monsoon, so tiger rattlesnakes and in some places rock rattlesnakes might give birth as early as mid-June. But most of them, it's July, August, and into September. And again, some of the species go pretty late in September, especially like a Western Diamondback who's going to be able to be active and feeding for still another couple months afterwards, so they can afford to go kind of late in the year. Although we have seen some of our mountain species give birth into early September, and they just yeah, they don't have a lot of time after that before they have to be back in their dens. Going back to that big picture, I just want to draw your attention to the mating, courtship, combat, and also when most of their feeding happens in the monsoon, but then they don't give birth until we've gone all the way around the circle and are back in the monsoon. For a lot of these females, especially the not Western diamondbacks, all of the other species, they don't eat during this whole period. They may have gone by the time they're giving birth a full year without eating anything. It's not that they won't eat. They will if they have the opportunity, but often, I mean, they don't eat when they're getting ready to go in their den for the winter. And the places where they den and where they come out in the spring, where they gestate and where they nest are just often not, it's different habitat than where they're feeding. So they just don't have the opportunity to feed. So because of this, they don't give birth every year. At the most, except in rare instances when we have a lot of like successive good winter rains and summer rains. They do not give birth every year. It's mostly every other year. In some cases, it's every 3 years. In our experience, it seems like that is especially common with the youngest females. After their first birth, they'll wait 3 years before they have another litter of babies. So, and that is because it takes a long time thinking back to that photo of the not pregnant snake. Like she did not look great. And they need time to recover from that because a lot of the, not mainly what I'm talking about in this presentation, but a lot of the care and investment they do in their babies happens before they give birth because it's big to go that long without food and having to be in good enough health to nourish those babies so that by the time that they're born, those babies are good to go and have a healthy start on life. So mostly now what we're going to be talking about is not that part of parental care for rattlesnakes, but we're going to be talking about the nesting season. So again, this is sometime in the monsoon, depending on which species and when they're giving birth. And yeah, so I kind of, and these are sort of like my own made up things, but yeah, I consider the nesting season for rattlesnakes to be that period between when they give birth. And again, they give birth to live babies. They don't lay eggs. They're not like carrying around eggs inside them. Their system is more similar to ours. They're providing nourishment to those babies throughout their pregnancy. So from that period until when the family splits, which happens after the babies undergo ecdysis, which is the fancy way of saying shed their skin, and that happens usually when the babies are about 7 to 14 days old. And they seem to, in our experience, go through these different stages of sticking close to mom, exploring, shedding their skin, and then the family kind of splits and goes their separate ways. Or in the case of those that den communally in groups, sort of go their separate ways because they're going to be back together again in a few weeks for the winter. So, what does nurturing or care look like for rattlesnakes? And I think it's easy to immediately get out of the way what it doesn't look like, or what I should say we haven't seen yet. And I think for a lot of people, when we think about caring for babies in non-human animals, we sort of default to birds because they're those obvious animals that are all around us that we get to observe more than almost anything else besides ourselves. And birds feed their babies. It's usually pretty easy to observe, and that is not something that has been observed in rattlesnakes. And I think it's not, I don't like to say never because like we're always discovering new things and always being surprised, but it would be a very difficult thing for a snake to do. Those snakes swallow their food whole, and that they don't really have, they don't have appendages. They don't really have teeth that are capable or very good at like tearing food up, especially rattlesnakes with those big delicate fangs, like tearing food up would probably just end up tearing their teeth up. So that makes it hard to share. And they also don't need to eat very often. Rattlesnakes are master fasters, so they can go for very long periods of time without eating. As we've already talked about, the females being able to go a year without eating, and even without like getting into like as good a shape as possible, they can go for a long time without eating. The babies are born with, hopefully, unless their mom was, not in the best of health herself, the babies are born with enough nutrition to keep them going for those first couple weeks. They do shift like immediately into hunting once the family splits up. But as far as we know, the moms are not providing nutrition to those babies. So what is she doing? So there's another thing that rattlesnakes as ectotherms need. And ectotherms mean that's again fancy way of saying cold-blooded. They depend on their environment and their behavior in that environment to maintain a stable body temperature. And for snakes, well, for all of us, when you're bigger and you're darker in color, you heat up faster and you are better able to retain that heat when you're a larger size than being like a tiny little snake. So kind of think about how, right now my fingers are cold and they're like the size of little rattlesnakes, but my body core, which is way bigger than my fingers, like it's pretty warm. And so I think that kind of illustrate what that is like. And then for a species like Arizona blacks, where the adults are much darker than the babies, they also heat up faster. And so what we've observed in not just the Arizona blacks, but with them more than the others, is that as the day the sun goes down and it gets late in the day, the babies will kind of like hop on mom like she's a heating pad. And we haven't been able to measure this in our snakes, but research on African rock pythons who are really big, and so you can put little like thermometer devices inside of them. They've actually been able to see where the babies are getting warmth from their mom in their burrows like overnight. So this is something that's happening in other snakes, so it's probably happening in rattlesnakes too. And the babies don't just do this by piling on mom. They seem to be using each other as well. So we like to call these baby wads. These are black-tailed rattlesnakes, and I don't even know. I think there's like 8 of them here. This is actually like from a couple different nest sites, and during the day at this high elevation site where it was kind of cool at times, the babies would form a wad together, and so they're actually kind of making themselves a big snake. And this is a still photo, but this is a dynamic activity. And so as the snakes, the babies on the outside are getting too hot, they sort of like crawl in the middle, and that enables the babies in the middle who may not be as warm to get warmer by being on the outside. And they're just constantly shifting so that together they're helping each other maintain stable body temperatures. And although this isn't something that the moms are necessarily providing for them, by staying together during this nesting period, it gives them the ability to do this, which they wouldn't be able to do if they just like, split from mom and were on their own as soon as they were born. So another activity that is, or another resource that's very important to them, is water. They're not able to get all their water from their food. They do actually need to drink. And the most reliable source in most of the places that these rattlesnakes live for water is rain. So rattlesnakes and a lot of snakes and lizards and some other reptiles will do rainwater harvesting. And what that means is just as it starts raining, they'll coil up, and they even have a sort of like special postures that they do with their body that helps the raindrops form little pools, and then they will drink it off of themselves. And so this still is from a time lapse video that we have on our YouTube channel of it's like family's first monsoon storm, And so you get to see how it starts raining and it initially startles the snakes, but then mom, who's the darker snake in the middle, like comes out, and then the babies immediately follow. So it's almost like they need to learn from mom that this is not so scary and it's actually something you need is to come out in this rain, even though it feels kind of cold and uncomfortable, so you can drink. And so in this picture, the baby on the left is drinking off of himself, and the baby on top of mom and mom herself are both drinking off of each other. And that's pretty common. They'll drink off themselves doing that harvesting posture. They'll also drink rain as it like drips down the walls of rocks that they're next to, and they'll drink off of each other a lot. And yeah, it's pretty cool thing to see. We have some other videos on our YouTube of not the whole family drinking. This is the only one, but of out of other snakes, like a little better quality video, so you can see what that rainwater harvesting behavior looks like. So the behavior that we were sort of like thinking about when we started watching rattlesnake nest was defense, because rattlesnakes are predators and they're kind of tough. So we wanted to see if they would actually defend their babies, like protect them from potential threats. And one thing that we noticed right off, so as I kind of alluded to earlier, this gestation period between when the females come out of the den in the late spring or early spring, depending on the species, until they give birth in the monsoon, this is like a few months in some cases. And when we first started watching, like we were watching them for this entire period. And we could like pretty much like walk right up and sit down next to some of these snakes during when they were gestating. They were super chill. They really seemed to get used to having us around. It didn't seem to be a threat, or we thought that's what was happening, was that they were just used to us. But when the first one gave birth, like the first time I approached the nest of a mama that had been watching through her pregnancy and she seemed totally used to me. And then one day I walked up to that nest and she's coiled up, just like the snake in this picture. She's rattling like crazy. And I'm like, what is going on with this snake? And then I see all these little babies who are like crawling as fast as they can into the shelter behind her. So their behavior does a hard shift as soon as those babies are born. And it is no longer tolerable for these scary humans to just like walk right up to their nest. So we had to start being a lot more careful so we weren't eliciting. I mean, it was nice to see that they were willing to defend their babies or at least try to distract a potential predator away from those babies. But also, we don't like scaring the snakes. But what we were really interested in was about their natural predators, not humans. And it comes as a surprise to people. I used to kind of like skip over this information in the talk because for me it's obvious that they have predators, but a lot of people, because they are scared of the snakes, think, well, what would possibly eat a rattlesnake? And it's a lot of things. So this is just one potential predator. But this was a trail camera that we had set up at the rock rattlesnake rookery in 2022 when we were monitoring that site. And this spotted skunk, and if you all haven't seen spotted skunks, they're adorable. They're like not much bigger than squirrels, so really small, but also like the most carnivorous of the skunk species. And this spotted skunk visited this rookery at night every day over like a 2 week period. Or maybe that was just how long we had the camera up. But he was kind of relentless in trying to find those snakes. And this is just one predator. They have a lot: badgers, fox, bobcats, mountain lions probably occasionally take rattlesnakes. A lot of birds. So roadrunners, of course, are famous for eating reptiles, but also your predatory birds, your owls, your hawks. Probably not eagles so much around here. Shrikes will take small snakes. There are other snake predators, so whip snakes, coach whips, racers, and king snakes are famous for taking snakes. I'm not going to be able to name them all, but they do have a lot of predators that they have to worry about. So what we ended up seeing, though, other than that skunk visiting that rookery, although thankfully the skunk was not successful in getting those snakes, um, was not a predator that we were expecting, or not a threat that we were expecting. So this is from time-lapse footage. Again, this video is available on YouTube, but I'm just going to show some clips from it. So this is a new-ish family of Arizona black rattlesnakes, kind of in the middle. See, the female is the dark brown one, and they're just like kind of resting in this shot. So, and then right here, this is the photo taken a minute before the threat appears in the next picture. And it's a little hard to tell because the picture's kind of dark, I know, but she has assumed that typical defensive posture where she looks about 2 times bigger now than she did here. It's just all of a sudden she's like a giant snake. She's coiled, she's lifted up off of her coils, and she's looking at something instead of just resting with her babies. A rock squirrel is not who we were expecting to enter the frame after that. Um, but rock squirrels and rattlesnakes have a really interesting relationship. And although we don't know because this nest was being monitored by these remote cameras for several weeks before we came back to retrieve them, so we didn't see any evidence that the squirrel actually killed any of these babies. But we have seen at other Arizona black rattlesnake nests where squirrels have actually killed and partially eaten some babies, but left behind enough where we were able to tell that's what had happened. And it certainly changed the behavior of this family after this squirrel attack. I mean, in the immediate was that the squirrel seemed to chase all the babies under the rock, and they were hidden for a while after that happened, and they just didn't seem as relaxed and that like totally just like laying down like they were in the first photo after the squirrel visited this nest. So the final thing I wanted to touch on is babysitting, because this is maybe the coolest and definitely the most unexpected. This was not something that we knew or suspected or hoped that we would see rattlesnakes doing because we didn't know it existed when we started. So I've thrown up this picture a few times of a rock rattlesnake rookery. Um, and so there's two adult females in this picture. There's one in the bottom, in the front who's very visible, has few babies on her. They're a little bit darker in color. These are all small snakes, so the size difference isn't great. There's also another female in the back, kind of in the upper right, and she has a baby sitting on her also. Neither of these females are these babies' mothers. So there were three females at this rookery, and the only one who has given birth at this time is hiding in her shelter at the moment. And these two ladies are both still pregnant. And it's not as obvious as it was in those Arizona black photos I showed at the beginning for pregnant and non-pregnant snakes. But when we were seeing these in real life, it was a lot easier to tell that these were still pregnant. And this is what we usually see at rookery situations. So this is an Arizona black female. Her name is TWA. She's one of, if not the oldest snakes that we've monitored. The first time we saw her, and we monitored her with Nest over the course of about 9 years. When the first time we saw her, she was the oldest, biggest snake. She always nested in a rookery situation with other females, and we never saw her with babies. Her babies were always taken care of by babysitters. And so what we've observed throughout is that in any given rookery, the oldest, so the biggest, the oldest female is the one that gives birth first, and then she disappears. She stays inside. She's like taking it easy, taking a well-deserved break, and she's letting the younger females take care of the baby. So she's kind of like sticking them with the parental care duties, and I don't know, sticking them with it. In other words, it's a learning opportunity for those young ones, right? They get to learn how to be moms themselves, while they have the backup of the more experienced female who's there if needed. And that's been pretty consistent for like most most of the nests we've monitored is that the young ones and that is what you see often in other species too, where there's social nesters, where you'll either have juvenile females who aren't even old enough or who like physiologically ready to start giving birth. They'll come to the nest, and so they'll help the mom and learn how to care for babies themselves. Or you'll just have, yeah, the young ones tend to like use this as a learning experience. And we see the same sort of care behaviors with the babysitters. So this is another very pregnant female with some babies next to and behind her. And we see them doing the same thing we've seen with the adults. We'll see the babies like sitting on top of them, possibly gathering that heat. We'll see the babysitters keeping kind of herding the babies away from crawling into dangerous situations before they're experienced enough to know where that is. And while it's usually the pregnant younger females that are sharing the nest, that's not always the case. So this is Roger, and he's an adult male, and he got to do babysitting duties a couple times when he showed up at the nest during the nesting season. And again, like same behaviors, Roger would crawl out into the sun first thing in the morning, and the little babies would follow him. And then when it got too hot, he would come back into the shade and all the babies would follow him there. Super cute. Unfortunately, the video is terrible quality, so we just have this picture to share. There's always an exception, and which is one of the things that like I just love about snakes. So this is a black-tailed rattlesnake. This is also a picture like I've thrown up a few times. And this was taken at a rookery. Again, three female rattlesnakes. And in this photo, there's actually two adult females. There's the one in the front that's very prominent. There's another one in the back that's really hard to see because it's dark. And there's babies surrounding her and behind her. And the third female is under an adjacent rock, like a couple feet away. And the third female is still pregnant, but the two here have both given birth and they're with their babies. So even though this was a rookery, there was no babysitting. And up until this rookery, which I think this photo was 2024, um, every time, every rookery situation, 100%. I had just been saying like, oh, if there's rookeries, there's babysittings. You never see mom with babies at rookeries until this nest. And what's funny is this same rookery site, the same thing happened last summer too, where it was like we had multiple females and only the moms would be with the babies, no babysitting. And it's not the same individuals because those were consecutive years. So those are different females in 2024 and 2025. I don't know what it is about this site that there's no babysitting. Although since I'm saying that now, I'm guessing this summer there will probably be only babysitting at that site because that seems to be how the snakes work, which is, yeah, for me, a lot of like why they're cool and why I love them so much. So that is my last like informational slide. So this is that link that I wanted to share with you where you can learn how to keep in touch with us, sign up for our email list where I regularly share snake stories and also opportunities to take action to help snakes and other wildlife. Um, and you can also, I've also included there like links to some of my favorite stories about rattlesnake mommies and babies, and also some of our most fun like YouTube videos of rattlesnake mamas and babies. That's all I got, and I'm happy to take questions for as long as we're able to do that.
Wonderful, Melissa. Thank you so much. That is absolutely amazing. The photos and the stories and just all of the data in that talk was absolutely incredible.
Thank you.
I learned a few new things, as always, about snake behavior. As I start asking some questions that have popped up in the chat, please feel free to put additional questions in the chat. One of those that we just got was actually around babysitting. Do you happen to know if the babysitting snakes are related to the snake that just gave birth? Like, are they related to the
Ah,
mom?
That is an excellent question. So we have a couple observations. So based on those patterns of where we've seen daughters go back and are at a rookery with their mom, and so then in those cases they are the babysitters. And I'm guessing it's more common than that. And some of those snakes are probably sisters. To the mom, or so aunties to the babies, or siblings from like previous years. But yeah, but we don't know if that's always the case. And I don't know about the males. Like I would love to. I'm guessing the males are probably more an uncle situation than a dad because they're most of the males that we've seen at nests are also share the den, and that's what we think. That's how we think those dens are probably built based on data from other species of rattlesnakes. But yeah, we haven't been able to do the DNA analysis on our individual snakes to say for sure.
Gotcha. Awesome. We have a couple of snakes, or sorry, questions, golly, about young rattlesnakes. So specifically, what does their diet look like? And then also, do they have venom and are they able to defend themselves?
Good question. Yeah, so snakes, like I said, they're most of them, especially most of our rattlesnakes, are pretty general in what they eat. And if it fits in their mouth, then they will eat it. And it's an animal. They don't eat plants. That does include insects, although I don't know that there's a lot of observations of rattlesnakes doing that. So lizards make up a lot of the diet. And yes, they have venom probably ready to go as soon as they're born. They certainly are like hunting, and I've seen like babies that have successfully like eaten something, have a little like food lump when they're just a couple weeks old. So they're ready to go probably from the get-go, just when they're still in the nesting situation. They just aren't behaviorally, mentally ready to go, like
Gotcha.
teenagers. Physically they are, but mentally they're not ready to be on their own. So I think lizards make up a lot of the diet just for size reasons. And because they're not usually like raiding mammal nests, that's not kind of a rattlesnake thing.
Okay, gotcha. We have a couple more questions around I have a question around once snakes start using a rookery with other female snakes, do they ever go back to nesting individually? Or it's like once they find that communal space, they like stick with it?
I've never, I'm trying to think. I don't think I've seen one switch back to being single, but I I'm not going to say that that doesn't happen because I think, a lot, considering that these sites have probably been used by like this community of snakes for thousands of years, like even visiting, monitoring one for 9 years is like such a small picture, that I think we're probably missing that. And a lot of their switching between sites and like what makes a place appropriate and usable for a group versus one snake or for no snakes, is probably determined some by changes in vegetation. Like when some of our den and nest sites had a fire go through, and that just completely changed like how hot or not these basking sites were, which means that it's not so good for gestation. Or if you have like a really good monsoon or a really wet spring and it's just covered in vegetation and there's not like any place to sun when they're in a cooler area like a forest, then that could change it. So I think that probably has more to do with the switching around than them deciding that one is more or less better. But um yeah, that is interesting. And I'm kind of like now interested in going back through to see if that is something we've documented or not, but I can't remember any instances of it.
Okay, gotcha. We have a couple questions around the snake-human interactions, which I know you said was kind of one of the other areas of your work.
Mhm.
One is if a snake is removed from a public spot humanely, or I guess snakely, and it is a mom snake, what becomes of her babies? Do they perish or get adopted by other snakes?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So I think most of the time, not always, but most of the time, the places where they're nesting are not like conflict situations. Although I know that is not only always true. I mean, if you follow Rattlesnake Solutions, which do a lot of snake coexistence work through moving snakes and fence building snakes. They usually end up moving some families of Western Diamondbacks when they move them. I mean, I think that time of year, a good snake relocator is going to be on the lookout for that to make sure the snake they weren't called about doesn't look like if you know rattlesnakes, that especially a female who has just given birth is very clear. Like it's very obvious what that looks like, and so you would be on the lookout for the whole group. Because I don't know. Presumably, this has benefits for the babies and is maybe something they need. But it is not something that's been studied as far as taking the babies away. There's like sort of indirect information from a study that were marking snakes differently, and they had some information of baby snakes who were captured in the field, marked, and immediately put back at the nest site versus one that were like taken into the lab and then released later. The ones that were put back in the nest immediately had higher chances of survival than the other ones. But other than that, and that again, that wasn't like a direct, that they weren't trying to study that. It's just something that came out of another study. We don't know. And it's one of those, it's like, it'll be interesting, but it's not something that I want to do in
Sure,
case.
sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. Kind of related to that, someone told a story about their local snake relocator saying it was illegal to move a snake more than a mile from where it was collected. He said it also that the snake lived at the house and knew the habits and would usually stay out of sight when they were active in the backyard. Is that accurate, or yeah, what was the snake like
Um,
nearby?
so I know some states do have like very strict, like you cannot move them any farther than X number of miles. I know the recommendation for moving snakes is like a quarter of a mile. Try not to move them more than a quarter of a mile because that keeps them within the home range for the most part. Um, I don't actually know if there is a rule in Arizona. If that's where that person was from or not. But it is true that they tend not to do well when moved outside of their home range, because yeah, where they winter, even if they're not, moms, or even if they're not wintering in groups, they tend to use the same places over and over again that are safe places. They will hunt in the same places year after year. They will go find mates, look for mates in the same places year after year, and feed. I mean, just everything. They're very tied to their home, the same as we are. If you drop me off in New York City, like I would be lost and not do well. Let alone like a foreign country. And that's how they are. The adults, it's a different story with juveniles that are still learning anyways, but with adults, they don't do well when they are moved outside of their home range. And so that could have also just been, like their rule, or I don't know. I could see being inclined to tell someone that was law just to help convince them to not ask me to take the snake 10 miles away or whatever to get it out of there.
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. We have a couple more questions still coming in around kind of snake behavior, and it's really just making me think we need to have you back and talk about snakes in general. But I do have one more that I want to ask verbally, which is, what if I want more snakes around my yard? I'm in urban Tucson. What can I do to encourage habitat for snakes in a city that they're probably here? They're just, what can I do to support snakes locally?
Ah, I love this question. I don't get this question enough. So I will plug that we have a kind of a sub website that's livingwithsnakes.org that is primarily geared towards like, there's a snake in my yard. I don't want them. What do I do? Or what do I do if I encounter a snake on the trail? Or what about snakes and dogs? So it's a lot of our coexistence stuff in one place. And so one thing you do is take all of our advice for how to discourage snakes and do the opposite, but
Perfect.
yeah, for the most part. But yeah, real quick, snakes are attracted to the same things as other wildlife. So the things that you would do to support and encourage other wildlife to use your yard works for snakes. They need water, they need food, they need shelter. So having those things, instead of having an elevated bird bath, which is what I normally recommend for if you do not want snakes or you do not want snakes using your bird bath for hunting, is to have a water feature on the ground that's accessible to them, both for drinking and also they will often like use those to hunt. Think about those the African like watering hole sort of hunting situations. That works here in the desert too for rattlesnakes. Feeding birds will often attract rodents for snakes. Having lots of places like cover, which can be lush native vegetation and shrubbery for them to hide in, and places for, yeah, around, Tucson to like give them shade so they have a place to cool off in the summer. They're not going to be out in full sun when it's 100 degrees. They need some place to hide. Um, there's some also like less attractive for people stuff like having a yard full of like junk, piles of rocks, piles of wood, piles of old metal roofing that is attractive to snakes and some of their prey as well. But you can also just like have a nice, lush native yard. And if snakes have a way to get there, they will likely show up.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Melissa, thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. If anybody on today missed any part of the talk, the recording will be up on our website and we'll also email it to everybody who registered. So you'll have a chance to listen again and see some of those wonderful images again. The Advocates for Snake Preservation also has a lot of amazing videos on their YouTube page. We'll make sure to include that link in that email as well. Like, please check it out. The videos are absolutely incredible. And then once again, we have a lot of events coming up with Sky Island Alliance. Please feel free to check out our calendar and join us in the field where you may get a chance to see snakes out in nature on some of our project sites. This has been just such a wonderful way to spend the morning. Thank you again, Melissa. And thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to our next snake encounters out there in the wild. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.